welcome back to another episode of Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I'm your host. It's good to be with you here this morning as we're going to be recording with Kruptos on Foolproof Theology. Kruptos is an Anon account. I believe this is the first Anon I've had, and we actually dive into the legitimacy of having an Anon account right at the top of the episode. Before we get into the conversation with Kruptos, I wanted to make sure you knew about the Patreon. If you go to the Patreon and sign up today, you get early access to every episode I release, and so you can get up to 4 episodes in advance. You can also start conversations, ask questions, suggest guests, and you also get some swag for signing up as well. So head over to the Patreon link in the show notes and enjoy this conversation with Kruptos. We are recording 7 a.m. Mountain Time, which is early for me, so you'll have to pardon my voice and lack of caffeine and nicotine at this time of day. But I'm glad to have a anonymous account on Twitter. I believe this is the first time I've had an anonymous account. The only other time I've had somebody that I didn't share their face on the YouTube, there are 2 times. One was Glenn Moots, because he looked like Fetterman. He's bald and had a hood on, and he didn't appreciate that aesthetic point of view. You can go listen to the episode. We had a great conversation. And the other one was our Acts 29 phone call, where the 2 gentlemen who we recorded, unbeknownst to them, did not have their face on YouTube. But I'm glad to have Kruptos. Am I saying this correct? Kruptos. That's right. On Twitter?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Well, thanks for coming on the show today.
It's really a pleasure. It's been good getting to know you a little bit, and I'm really happy to be on and to be talking about the reason why you invited me on here is this whole idea of managerial Christianity. So I'm excited about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think first of all, when I was talking with my wife about having an Anon on Twitter can be all sorts of different directions in terms of their benefit to society. Some people do it out of a sense of protection. Some people just want to edgelord, all this kind of stuff. Can you tell me a bit about the situation as an Anon on Twitter? Because one temptation I've heard, and I sense I would face too, is that if you're not mature, if you're not wise, you can almost create a duplicate personality, and it can lead to a lot of dissociative kind of characteristics. What has been maybe some reasons for you being Anon and remaining anonymous on Twitter?
Oh, it's funny that you mentioned the sort of dissociative behaviors, because anytime you comment on anything and people, you say stuff about relationships or guys or all of that kind of stuff today, people automatically assume that because you're an anonymous, you're like a 22-year-old incel who lives in his mother's basement, right? And you're like,
yep.
And then you sort of have to patiently explain to them sometimes. I turned 57 in a couple weeks. I have 6 kids. I have 4 grandkids, and I run a fairly successful business. It could be bigger, but I balance work and family and writing and doing all this internet stuff. So I'm remain anonymous partly for 2 reasons. One is I do run a business that, even though I'm a former pastor, so I did that I went through seminary. So I spent like a decade in school and then a decade in ministry. And I went through some stuff and about personal life in the church. And the recommendation was for me to step away from ministry for my marriage, for my own emotional well-being. And so I did that. They said, don't close the door on ministry forever. And I've actually flirted with a couple churches here and there over the last 20 years, but it's never actually happened. But so it always I preach regularly. But my main thing is I support my bills. I have a business that I run, and my business has a diverse clientele. And there is the very real possibility in today's context. I have a lot of Christian clients, but I also have, I'm from the frozen North who studied in the States and fell in love with America. And but here in the frozen North, the speech laws are much more draconian. So these things can be held against you politically, and people are much more willing to use this kind of stuff against you. And so for my wife's sake, she says, if you're going to do this, just do it anonymously. Don't, spread your face, your name out there. And so I, to protect my business, to honor her wishes, I keep myself anonymous. I'd rather not. I mean, I'm not afraid of anything I say or standing behind it or put my saying. As we were talking ahead of time, just before coming on the show, I had an interaction with somebody last week during the Southern Baptist Convention, one of the major pastors there, and he's like, "Who do I don't know you. You're an anonymous person. Why do I, why are you doing this?" And I'm just like, "Oh, this sucks to be behind this, the mask or whatever." But it is what it is that way. And then the second reason is one that's maybe more theory cell and intellectual. And I've talked about this with other people beforehand, and this flows out of the German author, critic of democracy and all of its internal contradictions, Carl Schmitt. And Schmitt noted that in any democratic system, that while we talk about the marketplace of ideas, there really isn't a free exchange of ideas, and that ideas tend to adapt themselves towards power. So for various reasons, either people want to keep themselves from being sanctioned by power, or a lot of times it's just to reap the rewards of the current power system and structure. They will adapt their thinking and their views to harmonize them with the power structures. And so one of the things that anonymity does is it allows you to speak freely. So you think of anonymity like the ballot box. The ballot, and this is the example that Schmitt uses. He says the ballot box is proof that the marketplace of ideas is a sham, because he says you're going into the ballot box, you can have all these people like hectoring you about vote this way, vote that way, here's a water bottle, here's your bus ride to and fro, all this type of stuff. And you can feel enormous pressure until you close that curtain and you're by yourself, and now you can speak your mind and vote your conscience. And so Schmitt argues that the very idea of a secret vote in democracy tells you that that the marketplace of ideas is largely a sham. And it's a sham for other reasons, but that's the one of them. And so, I mean, you can actually Google on, Wikipedia, and they actually have a chart of them, of the founders' pseudonyms, and they list them, the articles they wrote, and there's actually a lot more of them than you might realize in terms of pseudonyms, and a lot of obscure ones. And so even during those times, it was, nobody was ever bothered with it in the middle of the 1700s.
Right.
And they found that as a necessary part of free expression was the ability to do it anonymously. And nobody then was really worried that, oh, you're going to say something untoward because you're anonymous. No, you're going to protect your reputation, and, you're going to feel more free to speak because you can do so anonymously. Now, like anything, can you abuse a privilege? Sure. And people do it all the time. So they do it in a number of places. They say racist things, anti-Semitic things, they're misogynist. There's a whole range of things. And some guys just do it on purpose because they see this as political action, that the very doing of it is a form of political dissent. I don't agree, but, it's also these things where, because of the way that politics works and the way that certain conversations are sanctioned and labeled, that, can we have an uncomfortable conversation about this topic? Well, sometimes the only way to have an uncomfortable conversation about a topic is to do it anonymously. Yeah. And so people can feel free to speak their mind. And, then you really take their words as thing. And one of the side benefits of anonymity, and this is something that I've come to discover, is that a lot of the things that people normally use to evaluate you, like, oh, you're a fellow at this or this think tank, you have a degree in this and this or whatever, now you're automatically credible. Well, if you're dealing with a group of anons who can't put forward their credentials, there's only one thing that matters, is the strength of your rhetoric and your ideas. And
exactly,
if you can't hack it in the ring, you get exposed pretty quick, really, really quick.
Yeah, that's why the anons fascinate me. They in my speech recently at New Christendom Press, I suggested that one day they're going to do a study, and they did a whole study on the Reformed resurgence and this big new Calvinism movement, and sociologists have written books and all this. One day they're going to probably look back and do a study on this time, 2020, to whenever the movement kind of either dies off or morphs into something else, and they'll do a study. What are they going to call our movement? Is it going to be the truly Reformed resurgence, or is it going to be based anons for America? Because there's so many anons that it truly is a stripping away of all the credentialing mechanisms and the evaluation priors that we typically do. We all do it, and looking at, oh well, he's associated with this and he's associated with that, and it's like, no, like all you've got is like what you say. So
and for your audience that aren't aware, is that the guys who make it through that gauntlet and demonstrate that they have chops, all of them know each other behind the scenes. They go to conferences and greeting and meetups and so forth. Like once somebody pulls back the rope and you're in the club, it's the world changes dramatically. Like all these guys know each other. It's not that big a circle. And the thing is that they're just basically protecting themselves from bad actors. And there's a lot of bad actors out there who would quite happily destroy your life just for the fun of it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. One of the things you mentioned already, and I think it might touch on Managerial Christianity, which is the article you wrote that really caught my attention just because I found so much resonance with it. But one of the things you've mentioned is that thinking and ideas adapt themselves to power. And I tweeted yesterday about David French, who recently wrote another screed in the New York Times about the Ten Commandments and how bad they were. And I said, when we talk about regime evangelicalism or regime evangelicals, this is who we're talking about. This kind of thinking, this kind of behavior that's nonsensical. Would that be an example of thinking and ideas adapting themselves to power, or what are you thinking about there?
Well, yeah. I mean, like, I don't know how old most of you are, but I mean, I've been reading since 90s, early 2000s. I mean, David French emerged onto the scene after his tour in Iraq, I believe. He's a lawyer. And so he did military service, although I don't think he actually saw any combat. I think he was just basically office staff and so forth. But even so, he served, and he came back, and he was originally, seemed to be an advocate for a certain kind of, common sense or level-headed Christian conservatism in the public realm, that you're going to speak against abortion, you're going to speak against, the sexual revolution. And then I don't know whether it was Trump that broke him, but somewhere along the line, he chose a side, and the side he chose was the side of power in the regime, and not to speak against it. And so it's for whatever, and since making that adaptation, he has moved progressively more and more radical in his positioning. So there was a time where he was defending the liberal order as the best defense for, Christian self-expression, and, being able to maintain that your best hope is the American political system. And so we have a duty to defend it and so forth. So these basic traditional kind of Reaganite conservative positions that we have to defend the system, keep it strong. But then as he began to defend the system and so forth, when the system began to spit out obviously distorted results, that, well, the freedom of speech means that you need to have drag queen story hour. And he writes a defense of drag queen story hour. And you're like, okay, if that's what the neutral system defends, then that can, that's when you begin to sort of question, well, maybe the neutral system isn't where we want to be.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
Because these are obvious ills and harms in our society. Having creepy men dressed up in like garish makeup and dresses, playing with children, doesn't seem like something a healthy society. Then, a healthy society does. Then you begin to examine a lot of other things that, the free, like pornography as speech, all of these types of things you begin to question. And then he defends the satanic altar in the Iowa State House, and he comes out in favor of, we have to be accepting of transgenderism and homosexuality because, we need to be accepting of other people differences in lifestyle, because if we don't accept them, they won't accept us, these types of things. Right.
Yep.
And that's, he adapts. And, he's maybe the most obvious, but there are also a lot of others who are a lot more subtle. And those are the guys that you really have to be scared of, because they're the ones who can talk the talk of conservative evangelical or conservative Catholic or conservative Orthodox theology. They have all the right phrases down, and they use them very, very skillfully to reassure you that they are one of you, and you are one of them, and they say all of the right things. And you really, in order to take them apart, and like someone like John Harris does an excellent job. He just patiently spends hours just, taking them apart statement by statement. And so recently, that's what I did.
Bruce
Franks, that's it. Yeah. So Bruce Frank got up in front of this Southern Baptist convention, and he was running for president of the convention. And he said some things, in 100 years, theology is really important, and sound theology is really important. But when you weigh it on the balance of everything, and you put it in and you line it up with what's really, really important, what are people going to be talking about 100 years from now? Well, that we were bringing people in, and they were submitting themselves to the lordship of Christ. Now, and you're thinking, whoa, that's awesome, right? That's what we want. We want people coming in, submitting to the lordship of Christ. But he's just pattered off. And if you're not paying attention, you don't realize that what he's done is just rolled off the phrase that you want to hear. And now you're thinking that he's one of you, but really he isn't, because what he doesn't really mean that. Because if he was serious about people submitting to the lordship of Christ, then sound theology, sound teaching would matter a lot. And what does it mean? What do the scriptures teach about how you're supposed to live your life? The early the early church had like a few, when the Gentile believers came in, they had a very few small requirements. There was about eating meat sacrifice to idols, things. But one of the primary things was sexual immorality. Because it was rampant in that society. And so, the question, does Bruce Franks, what does he mean by submitting to the lordship of Christ? Does he mean that we're going to be calling people to repentance? Or is the goal just to build a successful church where people are in the door? Because we talk about it nowadays between, and I know you're a church planter, Chase, so you're probably used to some of this language. We talk about the churched and the unchurched. Right. Mm-hmm. And so you have these two columns, and you're basically like an accountant. And the idea is to move them from column A, where they're unchurched, into column B, where they're churched. And as long as you can do the accounting, everything is good. Right. And I know, because Bruce Franks runs a large megachurch, and that's how it operates. And yes, the Lord does use these churches, and people do come to Christ, and they do grow in discipleship, and many do submit to the lordship of Christ, and there's no denying that. But when you begin to look at the implications of the words that they're saying and playing it out, what they're basically saying is that me growing a successful church organization is more important than enforcing sound theology and enforcing a biblical lifestyle, a godly lifestyle, or not forcing, but calling people to a rigorous biblical and godly lifestyle. And, so there's the thing, it's like, and you get this now of like, well, we have to be welcoming and accepting. We have to be, and it all comes downstream from the stated goal, which is, building a successful church. And well, why are they have the goals of building a successful church? Well, that's where you get back to managerial theology. So I called him out on Twitter about it, and he wasn't happy. And this is the kind of thing. And one of the problems is these guys are so slippery, is that when you call them out, you look like the narrow-minded autiste who's majoring in minors, and all this kind of, like, you get all the language. Like, I've
totally,
I went to seminary, I know how it works, right? It's So it's one of these things, and you have to really just like, whoa, stop. What did you say this there? What did you mean by that? Did you really mean what you say there? And you almost have to go like statement by statement, just start really holding their feet to the fire, because they will just. Somebody said to me that we call that here sprinkling the Jesus butter on things, right? Or laying out the Jesus. And so they know how to slather the Jesus butter on the toast and say all the right things. And I thought, well, that's a new one for me. I had kind of heard that one before, but it's been a while.
Yeah, some people will call it a Jesus juke, where you're constantly kind of over spiritualizing the language. But I've seen this a lot, where with different pastors or institutions, where I've met with presidents of seminaries, not because I'm somebody important. Particularly back then, I was nobody, but I was challenging their ideas. They talked about having a generous approach to theology, where we're neither the fundamentalists nor the liberals. And I was like, well, then why are the only statements you release consistently punching against the right and coddling up to the left? Your January 6th statement, your George Floyd statement. And so I challenged them. I said, we pulled out of Afghanistan. This is a seminary that trains missionaries. There are Christians there that are suffering. We should release a statement on Afghanistan. He goes, oh, we don't do statements anymore. And I was like, how convenient. I was like, you say you want to do both, like, and on the one hand, that's a strategy, that's a tactic. You could run that play. I don't think it's as viable. I've tried that, but they're very much into a type of deceit, and that's the hard thing for me to discern. And it's not even necessarily my job to discern, where their intentions lie and what their aims are. But I think that's why I wanted to talk about managerial Christianity, because I think this informs a lot of the kind of background to the way ministry operates. And just so you know, and so for my audience knows, nobody ever taught me James Burnham. Nobody ever had to give me, this is what success looks like just raw, data. But as soon as I got into ministry, it was very much like, well, this is how you should manage a church. This is how you, whether it's through discipleship programs, through spreadsheets, through helping people grow, through organizing all the different groups, and you can have these pipelines, and you can have all this kind of stuff. And I kind of geeked out on that for a little while. And I was like, okay,
I did too as well.
I could see this, and I could see how this could be
run the
successful.
church like a business.
Yeah. And I just became, it felt insufficient and dehumanizing, because I saw the mega church model of that, which is inherently can be dehumanizing. There's a lot of good mega churches out there that are trying to be faithful to the Lord, but it's very programmatic. And then 2020 hit, and I was, especially when I think that was the crisis moment, was all of a sudden the programs, the standard operating procedure, out the window, and now just raw performance in front of a camera. And it's like, okay, I don't want to do this. Is why don't I want to do it? And what would I rather do? And what does that say about what I was doing beforehand? Not that I was always doing the managerial Christianity. I'd kind of walked away from that and been exploring some other ways. But does that resonate with you? Is that what you saw too?
Yeah, like it's one of those things where I had encountered Elul in university, and the importance of it didn't really sink into me until after I'd left ministry. Because when I was in ministry, I was in seminary. I don't know if you remember. You remember Tom Peters, the management guru? That may have been a little bit before. Yeah, maybe a little bit. But he was huge, McKinsey and Company or whatever. And he was huge. And he was talking about, the power of management, the power of, well, let me see. I've got, where do I have them handy? Yeah. So like these books.
All right, what do we got?
Liberation Management.
That aren't going to be able to see this. Liberation Management and Reimagine.
Like Reimagine, Tom Peter, right? So all of these books. Right? And now you can learn a lot of stuff about running if you want to really learn how to run an organization, like a managerial organization, Tom Peters will do it for you. That's the straight stuff there. And from there, everything else was just a lot of times, most of it, the rest of it after Peters was just derivative. It's just, Tom Peters with a different name on it. But so what happened is some of these things that I had learned with Jacques Ellul started to bubble up again when I got out of the ministry and just stepped away and started paying attention. And then I begin putting two and two together. And part of it is, it's not just Jacques Ellul's work, but also Marshall McLuhan. It's this idea of understanding that there's a managerial system or a technical system. And Marshall McLuhan talks about, the medium is the message. So what McLuhan argues is that the technological system itself is the important thing and not the content, right? And so once the example that you would use maybe is a television, right? That the fact of a television is more important than any of the content on the television, right? And so you can have good programming, you can have bad programming, but whether you're watching, wholesome programming or you're watching porn on your television, you're still a couch potato with a 3-second attention span, right? So all of the changes that occur when you're watching television, and some would argue that even the wholesome children's programming, it's just basically a variation of porn.
Wow.
On your television, right? Because it ends up having the same effects on you. So now you take that insight and you begin to look at like a church, and you think, you look at a church and you say to yourself, the medium is the message. And you begin examining. So you start looking at all of the things that we're doing here and saying, the message isn't the songs, it isn't the sermon, it isn't the thing. The message here is the way we're doing things. Right. So, you could look at it from an anodyne point of view, like say the difference between a Catholic church and a Protestant church. So with a Catholic church, front and center are the sacraments. And then with a Protestant church, front and center is a pulpit. And so right away, the sort of the medium of the message tells you one of the fundamental differences between Catholicism and Protestantism. One is sacramental and one is organized around preaching. So that maybe gets some of that idea. So then when you look at somebody like Jacques Ellul and you're thinking, you have this, the medium is the message ticking in the back of your mind. What Ellul argues with technology, he says, we as human beings are like tool using creatures, right? So one of the things we do is we use tools. And what Ellul argues is that there's a transition that happens at some point with the ancients, pre-modern, and pre-moderns built things like pyramids and cathedrals and so forth. We're not talking like, people living in mud huts,
right?
But pre-moderns, when they used tools, they used a small number of tools, but they used them in a variety of situations. So what was decisive was the skill of the tool user. And we can also think of things like laws, like written laws are a form of, it's a tool, right? But a lot of the knowledge on how to use these tools, whether they're hand tools to build things, whether they are, the way that we run things, whether it's the laws that we have written down, the decisive thing is that the deeper meaning, the real importance of these laws are held in the memory of the community. So, for example, you could take something like the 10 Commandments, and they're held in the memory of a community. But how you apply them, right, is basically the skill of the person applying them. You don't have a 6,000-page policy manual that details every situation that you could possibly encounter, but you would have somebody in your village who's knowledgeable in the ways of the village. And when you have an idea of like, okay, how do we apply, what do we do in this situation? They use their own wisdom and judgment based upon the things that they've learned, and they apply the law. It's in the same way you would have the craftsman's, his skill in the tools enables him to build and make the things that he builds. Right? So you could think of the example I often give to people is think of, like a medieval manor with a lord. He's got stables, he's got his horses for his knights and so forth. And he has people who are in charge of that. Now, the people who are in charge are directly in charge. So if you have a stable master, now he's probably not a nobleman. He might be a minor noble, right? But the stable master is in charge. So if, let's say, all of the master's horses die, he's losing his head, right? He's out, his family's impoverished, whatever, he's done.
Yeah.
That's it. But he's probably not come in from the outside. He's probably learned this job from the ground up. So he became a stable boy. Maybe he was outside of the castle. His father looked for an opportunity for him. So he sent them off to the Lord's castle to learn the dates, and he got a job as a stable boy, and he was mucking out stables, and he spent years caring for animals, learning how to saddle horses, learning how to care for the animals, learning how to feed them, watch out for diseases, learning how to manage all of the affairs of stables. He's worked himself up from, stable boy to stable hand. And eventually he becomes the stable master's right-hand man, and he's training, but he's learned and interiorized this whole culture himself. Now, the old stable master passes away. He's elevated and he's made stable master, right? And that's but how to be a good stable master is held in memory. It's learned through culture. It's over. So what happens now in the modern era is you think of like Taylorism, time and motion studies. So somebody comes to the Lord and he says, hey, listen, we can improve the efficiency of your stables. So he sends in his consultants, right? And they go through and they come in, they break down everything. They do interviews, they do everything. They break down every process in the stable. They detail it or whatever. They go back to New York. They have meetings about it. They discuss how can we improve the processes of the stable. They break it all down. And then they think, hey, what can we automate? Can we outsource any of this? And they come back. And then what happens is they develop this plan for, best practices for stable management. And now what they do is then they sell this almost like a franchise to other stables. So you can have, and so what happens is you take what was once a living thing and you abstract it out. Then you can deal with it separate from you don't even have to be involved in stables. You can go and get a degree from Harvard in stable mastery, never seen the inside of a stable. Right. That's kind of how it works. Yeah. And then what happens is rather than the people in the stable learning these things from the ground up, they're now trained by back from the policies back in, and by the experts on how to manage a stable. And so what becomes decisive is no longer the interiorized skill that's in the person. What is decisive now is this abstracted, rationalized plan that can be then maybe automated, outsourced, broken down into pieces, and so forth. And so what Elul argues is you take this and now imagine it happening on a society-wide scale. And he says they integrate, they interrelate with each other. And really, in the end, the decisive thing about technology in a technological society is not the actual devices in your hand. It's the way of thinking about the world. So every problem then becomes a technical problem. So every situation that you face, you come at it from the point of view of a McKinsey & Company consultant who's going in to analyze the problem, break it down into its constituent, find out everything, and we're going to develop a best practices plan that we're then going to impose to fix the problem. So now, if you think of a church like a stable, right? So a church at one point functions like a living organism, like the stable. So you come in, you learn the ways of the community from the ground up. You might even be taught how to preach, how to do theology, everything from the ground up. You might have gone to a seminary and learned some of those ways. But when you come back, you're integrated into the community. And there is a whole way of that's there. It's living. It's in, and sometimes it's in the past, it was hierarchical. And so what happens is that, people were pitched on this idea of, we've always had as Christians this idea that we need to be reaching out to those who are non-believers, to be bearing witness to what Christ has done in our lives out to the world. And like Paul, his agony, I wish that I could give my own life and give up my own salvation to save others, right? That's kind of the attitude that we're supposed to have as believers, that we would sacrifice our own salvation to see others saved, with that kind of earnest sort. So when somebody comes to you from McKinsey & Company and he says, hey, I've got this great plan, we can build churches and reach the lost. And so what happens then is somebody develops a technology, a way of thinking, and a set of systems that bring people in, get them into the churches, and then you have all these things. We're going to disciple them. We're going to train them. They use all the language of, they're not really discipling in the way that Jesus discipled. They're more training them. Right. But then we're going to integrate them into. So, you take a normal church where you had a living community, And as a whole, you break that all up into its constituent parts. You make this big successful churches, but now you have no community. So what do? Well, you develop a system to create community. So now you have small groups, and everybody has to be part of a small group, right? Yeah. So you took what was done naturally, and now you've made it into a machine, right? Yeah. So what happens is the mega churches is church as technology. Now that's not to say, like, even in the scriptures, right? Jesus, should we tell them to stop preaching in your name? Well, Jesus says, well, whether they're preaching for money or they're doing it for the wrong reasons, they're still preaching. Yeah. So there is this sense of, even if you're doing church as technology, right, you're still preaching the gospel in the end. And a lot of times they're preaching the gospel. So we have to acknowledge, like, I myself am part of a big mega churches. I know the pastor, we went to school together, and my parents did like old school evangelism. I think of like my 80-year-old mother doing door knocking and, that type of stuff, just going around in the neighborhood, doing the door knocking. And she's a really quiet introvert, but she has street cred for like personal evangelism in a way that many others don't. Right. Yeah. But they're in their 80s. They moved into town with us about a decade or so ago. And they went to this church, and I thought, I moved away from home when I was in my 20s, and now my parents have moved close to me. I'm going to go to church with my parents because this is fun. So I just basically went wherever they went, and so it was nice. So now I'm part of this mega church, and I generally like the pastor, but I look around and going like, okay, church's technology is not really my thing. And I can kind of see it all as, and watch what's happening. But this is the way. And, the one nice thing that I get though is, 2 or 3 times a year, you'll see 40 or 50 people up there making profession of faith, getting baptized and so forth. And you're thinking, okay, I'm just going to, like, we're here talking about it in Theory Cell, but inside that church, I'm not going to be the one raining on somebody's parade or banging the drums, because I just don't want to be that guy. Yeah. But when push comes to shove, theoretically, would I rather this church growing by some other means? Yeah, because I think there's a certain cost that comes with church as technology. Now, because I can watch my own pastor for this idea of welcoming people and making them feel comfortable, where he will pull his punches. Yep. Right. Because you don't want to make people uncomfortable in the wrong way. Now, I will give him credit that for my pastor, he is good on occasion. He will just basically lay it out. He says, we're going to have a series of really tough things about, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And then he'll lay it out back to back to back. He'll do money, he'll do sex and sexuality, and you know what I mean? So he does do this. So to his credit, he does do them. But there's other times where I know, just because it's a seeker service, that he'll pull his punches. Yep. So you ask, well, what's the problem? You're saying, Kruptos, this all seems to be working. People are coming to church, they're getting baptized. What's the problem? Well, the problem with the technological system is that it really isn't, in a sense, conservative. Right? So we have to understand, in place the technological system within the larger framework of progressivism, right? So we think of science and human progress and also social progress, all these ideas that we now think of as progressivism, that we can apply human ingenuity to society to fix all of society's ills. So in a sense, we can approach all of society like those McKinsey and Company analysts who are going into the barn or into the church to improve the processes. Hey, we can do the same thing for society itself, right? And then if you begin with sort of this basic idea that people are blank slates, and that, or they're more or less good, you ditch the whole idea of original sin. You're thinking, well, if people are born basically good, then the problems must be out there in society. Right. So, hey, if we can just get things right in society, if we can just program all of the systems of society correctly, well, then we can engineer ourselves into a kind of good utopian society. We can right all the wrongs, we can make things, and people will just grow up, they'll be born, and because society is so fabulous and good, the people will be fabulous and good, right? And that's kind of the basic presumption. So you begin with, the engineering of society, and you sort of, and this is kind of the way it works, is you You go in, you analyze it, you break it down, and then you realize, oh, there's some problems. So then we go back to the drawing board and we fix it. And there's this kind of progressive, we keep getting better and better and better and better and better. And within this managerial complex, it's just the very idea of managerialism is this idea that we are progressing to make things better and better. Now you think about it in terms of church renewal, right? So this is this idea that there's kind of a utopian dream. So if you pitch it to people like this, you think, and you look at the church renewal process, it's usually focused on what do we have to redo in the churches. We got to rejig our worship, we got to rejig certain process, we got to rejig our programs. And what are they actually preaching? Well, there's a kind of church utopia that we're going to get to. So it's a utopian vision. So that if we fix all these things in the church, we fix our worship, we fix our programming, we fix all of these different aspects in the church, then we will just sort of emerge naturally into church utopia. And so it's a very similar progressive vision. And so what then happens as you're plugged into this progressive system and you're moving towards progress, and this is really why, like for a political perspective of why, seizing the administrative state and making it conservative is never going to work, because it was built by progressivism for progressivism.
Sure.
And this is really the thing that people, so when you say, oh, I'm going to run our church like a business, basically what you're saying is that, well, we want to grow our church and we're going to put ourselves on the path of progressivism, but we're not going to realize we're going to do it because we and a lot of it comes down to, and here's the thing I think for people, and maybe this is the key thing for the audience. One of the things that Jacques Ellul argued, and this is a hard thing I think for a lot of people to grasp, people can get the idea that technology is neither good nor bad. It's never all good or it's never all bad. Right? Because we can see the goods around us. We know, like modern medicine, we can look at the prosperity, we can just see the goods that come from them.
Sure.
And they're pitched to us. But we do know that there are certain ills, right? So what do people do? And they look at their technology, well, this is an inert device, right? So it's just laying there, it's just a lump of circuits, wires. You see this very often in the Second Amendment debates, right? Over firearms. A gun, it just lays there on the desk. What's really important is, right, because we know it can be used for good and it can be used for evil. The really important thing is that you use it for good. So that if you as a user use it for good, the technology becomes good, right? And so this would be the argument for managerial systems.
Gotcha.
Right? Okay, so that we're using the business tools, we're going to put them to service in God's kingdom. So we're using the same things that they use in the administrative state for progressivism, but we're going to take those and we're going to use them for good ends, and we're going to use them in service of God's kingdom. And that's what they tell themselves, and I'm sure that's 100% what they believe. Right. Now, what Jacques Ellul argues, and I think he is correct in this, is that technology is neither good nor evil, nor neutral, but technology and technique, technical ways of thinking, they don't care. He calls them ambivalent. And so what Ellul argues is that every technology, when you implement it, and that's like a technical system. So this includes that plan you have for redesigning the stable or building a seeker-friendly church. We're going to get a growth. So that plan always has within it, once it's implemented, it has certain goods that will come of it, and it has certain ills, and they come together, right? And then if you try to fix the ills that result, and usually what happens is the goods are front-loaded, and the ills show up later down there, the costs that he calls them, so the costs. And he says the costs come, you can't predict many of them, and they can't be accounted for ahead of time. And as you try to fix those problems with more technique and more technology, this is that the promise is that progressively we can eliminate all the problems and we can arrive at utopia. Yeah. But what Ellul argues is that because the goods and the ills always come together, every technical solution you use to solve a previous technical problem will itself produce more ills. And so you never, ever actually get there. And then what Ellul argues is that the problems get more and more and more complex, and the systems get more and more and more fragile.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so what you're being sold is a bill of goods that it's going to make us better. And then the next plan is going to make us better, and it's going to make us better. And we're going to, you keep refining it. But the problem is you never get there.
Right.
And the reason you never get there is because of the nature of technology itself. It doesn't care. And this really is in many ways the danger of introducing technical systems. Is what you're doing is you're taking something that should be essentially a moral and a spiritual thing, you're offloading it onto the system. So now you as a participant in the church bear no moral responsibility for how the church comes out. There's nothing you have to do. There's no burden placed upon you, because as long as the systems get fixed and get worked out, we're going to have a healthy, dynamic, growing church. It's going to be fun and fabulous and awesome. It's going to be cool and everything. Right. And that's the other thing that the draw-in, right? Because now you're trying to make, because you're trying to be open and opinion, you're trying to make Christianity cool and so you're inherently putting in place a system, and one of the costs of this is that by introducing technical systems, you also introduce the imperatives of technical systems. So one of the technical systems is that you begin to solve problems technically. And so again, if you are drawn to power, and the power says that, progress is such and such. So if, let's say, racism is bad, right? And here's kind of how it works. Racism is bad. Well, if you have a properly ordered theology, you know that even though the gospel is always incarnate in particular places and times, and it's never an abstract thing that exists, somewhere out there as a, it's always instantiated. But even so, you recognize that all of us as Christians are bound under the higher loyalty, despite our differences in culture and place or whatever, by our higher loyalty to Christ, right? And so we have that vision of Revelations, like the 144,000 of every language, tongue, and they're all praising the Lord together. They all come together under the banner of Christ. And that's the heavenly vision that we're given. And we think, well, church can be and it should be like that. But now, so while that's a good thing, and when you turn it into a technical system, then now the problem is not in here with my spirit, with my own moral behavior, my relationship with Christ and so forth, and also the character of our community. We talk about that culture and character of our community, that like our moral and spiritual condition as a group of people. Are we angry haters? Are we bad people? Do we need to repent of our behavior? All this kind of stuff, right? But so now the problem is out there. It's in the systems. It's in society. So how then do you achieve it? Well, you do it the way that the managerial world tells you, is you develop managerial systems that then impose upon society a certain technological solution. And once that technical solution will then eliminate racism by creating equity. And so what happens is that we're going to be, and so this is how these types of systems get implemented. So what becomes important is not your moral character, your spiritual condition, but do you have the right systems in place? And these systems then, and this is one of the downsides of these systems, is that they can be gained by grievance politics. Yeah. Right? So then what happens is people are not put forward because of their spiritual or moral character, but because they fit a box. And so what happens is that the system begins to override the spiritual condition of the people, and it's all done then in the name of using all the terms and so forth of Christian theology.
Yeah. So with the system though, because you talked about a lot of very helpful things, especially from Elul. A lot of my friends talk about Elul. This has been a very helpful explainer for me as someone who has not done the work, so to speak, on Elul, but I'm very familiar with a lot of these concepts. I always try to think, because I was that way as a pastor who was into that stuff, and I think back on my own story. Like a good example for me was my father is a subcontractor, irrigation sprinkler subcontractor in Texas. And so I grew up running around the job site, digging ditches as a little kid, then digging ditches in high school, then digging ditches in college. And I would work. And then I go to college and I get a degree in construction management. And then you go work for a general contractor and you get on the job site and everyone despises you because you are that expert that went to the institution, and now you come in and you do, whether you mean to or not, you think I have all the latest and greatest ideas. For example, in construction, you have scheduling, and at the time it was P6 was a software program, and I come into the job site and they're not using P6, they're not using this software, they're using pencil and paper, and yet their higher ups in corporate want them to use P6, and I'm trained on P6, and they're like, well, we want you to take our pencil and paper every week and redo the schedule. And I was like, well, that's going to take like 10 hours. If we would just hold to P6 and not do the pencil and paper, it runs. It's a system. It's management. And they're like, yeah, we don't want to do that. We're old school. And I was like, so I'm just going to waste my time reconfiguring P6. Anyways, but that's the kind of stuff I think about. And the same thing happens in seminaries. You go to seminary, you could go to Baylor, then you could go to Denver Seminary, have never worked for a church, get hired by a church, and have never been part of that. And that's very frustrating for both parties.
99% of seminarians.
Yeah, it's very hard. And I feel a great deal of sympathy for people like that.
Having been there, I
and so
having gone through that, being thrown into the deep end out of seminary, I know, I have firsthand experience.
It's difficult because people don't care. People don't care about how, how smart you are, all that kind of stuff. They want you to be smart, but they don't want to talk about all the stuff you talk about in seminary. So my question is what, there's two I have. One, give people an alternative vision, because right now it's kind of it's a critical read on industrial revolution, society, technology, all this kind of stuff, and I sympathize with it a great deal. And this, maybe the analogy of the stable is the most helpful, but what's an alternative vision for how we approach particularly the church? I think business is a different conversation that I don't think we should.
No, it's fine. This is good. I think
church is the most interesting to me, mainly because it's my vocation. Is how would we inhabit that system, knowing that we still have a duty to manage money well, right, or to care for people well, without imbibing, because the temptation, I think, for someone like me who tends to take an idea and run with it, is fine. Go, okay, we're going to be Amish then. No tech, or fine, we're going to scrap the technology. We're going to do hymns only, no screens, no speakers, all this kind of stuff. So what would be an alternative vision?
Yeah. So this is good. So I think one of the things we have to recognize, one of the positives that come from technology is, as you mentioned it too, you were talking about your, with your scheduling program. One of the benefits that comes from technique is that it enables you to harness resources at scale. And that's why you're able to make these ministry churches. So one is harnessing resources. Our global systems are built on technique because you need these techniques to build this kind of global system at scale,
right, with
the efficiency it does. People look at say the federal government in the US and think, well, that's really, really inefficient. And Elul says, no. He says, you have no idea the amount of information that a federal government has to take in and process every day. He says, an entity like the American government is probably about as efficient as it can be. Now, you may be able to make it a little bit more efficient, but it's only going to be efficient at the edges. And it's about as efficient as it can be because it uses technique. It's just the scale is, you can't comprehend the scale of something like the US government. Now, the other thing that technique allows you to do is it allows you to create consistent, predictable results. And that's one of the real selling things, is that you can, regardless of, and the other thing is it smooths out differences and variances in ability. So you can create a higher floor for your ability, because if you're relying on the skill of each person to sort of use the tools, then you're really dependent upon the abilities of the people you have in hand. But if you can create a few machines and you have a few power tools that take away some of that skill stuff, you mechanize some of it, and you set a floor with certain procedures and techniques, you can then employ a much greater number of people at a higher level of output with a greater level of consistency and quality. And this is the real advantage that, in applying it in a church system is the same thing. But here is the downside, is a lot of you were talking earlier just about dehumanization. And it's really in the things that we would talk about, productivity, efficiency, all of these things is where the dehumanization comes from. And so it's a recognition that, that true efficiency, we might say, comes with mastery. The kind of, when you watch a really skilled person using tools, that develops that economy of motion, because of their advanced skill and mastery of the techniques. We call them techniques, right? So of the skills that you would have in, say, craftsmanship or something. That's a very different thing than, what we would normally talk about productivity and sort of, how many widgets are you pushing through the system that way.
Right.
So one of the things that we have to recognize is we can't get rid of technology. It's here. So we have to learn to grapple with it in a way in which we're not buying into the progressive ideology. It's not going to save us. So we have to then think in terms of trade-offs. So we recognize that when we adopt a certain system, that certain evils are going to come because of its use.
Yep.
Because we live in a sinful world and we have to accept that. And then if we can't live with those evils, we can say, I think for us as a community, using this technology is not a good thing. So you'll get a sense of like the Bruderhof communities that similar to the Amish, but sometimes they will mechanize things, but they're very intentional to say, we will talk about it as a community. So sometimes when we're doing things as a community in the businesses that we run as a community, we need to bring a machine in. But we ask, if we bring this machine in, what is the impact going to be on the community? Is this going to put somebody who has productive labor out of work in a way that we can't provide productive work for them because their meaning is in this portion of work? But if we can then, if they can be integrated into the use of this machine and it can become a healthy part of our community for both its benefits and its downsides, then yes, we can adopt this, but it becomes part of a whole community process. It takes time, which is one of the things, the acceleration of, the development cycle doesn't really allow this. Right? So that's the one piece, is that we have to get comfortable. I've always talked about it in terms of the tank problem, right? So from a nation state point of view, if your neighbor is rolling tanks off the assembly line and you want to be an Amish nation, that's not going to work long term because they're going to overrun you with their tanks.
Right.
So you have to have a way to deal with their tanks.
Yeah.
It's curious. You look at like the Russia-Ukraine conflict and you're realizing like drones. Oh, yeah. I don't need tanks. I can have drones. Now all of a sudden you look at drones like, dang, drones are scary.
They are.
Now we have a drone problem. It's not the tank problem anymore. We got a drone problem. We got to go. But you get the kind of idea so there's a certain sense of there's these certain technologies, both as communities, that you have to be able to grapple with. And you have to be able to wrestle with, but you want to do so understanding that there's trade-offs, there's goods, that there are ills, and can we as a community then absorb those ills into us as a community and integrate this technology into our life? So that's the one piece.
Okay.
Now then the other thing is recognizing that the human and the spirit comes from, in many ways, the inefficiencies and so forth. Like that it comes from those areas in life that, you can so you can make a machine to sweep your streets, right? But what are you going to do about that guy with an 85 IQ, an 80 IQ, who can't operate a machine consistently? But guess what? He can sweep streets. And he can have his 3 blocks of streets that he sweeps on a regular basis, and his streets are super clean. He knows everybody in the neighborhood. It's not super efficient, but those streets are clean. He has meaning in his life. And yeah, we could replace him with a machine, but we don't. So there's that component. So you think about the thing. And then there is fundamentally the recognition, and I think this is the orientation, that the technological church is fundamentally a materialist solution for a spiritual problem. So we are sold very much in the modern era that all of our needs can be met materially. That whatever need that we have, we can meet it through material goods. So through technique, through products, through services, we can meet all of our needs. One of the things that's being exposed in our society is that you can't meet every need material. But the problem is that we have materialized everything, right? So and church, we have all this God language that labels everything, but we function on a day-to-day basis like we're philosophical materialists, as if God doesn't exist.
Right.
So we do church, we build church, we run churches. God is using it, but when you really bore down and look at how we do things and we run churches and we use a lot of God language, but when you really peel back the hood on this thing, you're like, if you stopped using God language, how different would it look?
Right.
Not very. Right? It would look like any other business that has a product to sell. So then the question becomes, the world is hungering for something, and we can bear witness to it. And that thing that they're hungering for is a real living connection with the Lord. So one of the things that happened in, again, the Protestant Reformation was in many ways partly a technical type of, we rationalized the reading of the word, and so it had profound benefits, but also certain downsides. And one of the things that Protestantism did is it prepared people for a world that's oriented around philosophical materialism.
Sure.
Because it shoved aside all of this stuff that we would talk about, like superstitions, So it democratized the Christian faith. So we're going to get rid of specialists who do nothing but, seek the Lord, the monk, right? Going to get rid of him because everybody needs to seek the Lord. And everybody does need to seek the Lord. But we're also going to get rid of all of these superstitions that people have, praying to saints and all the rest of it. We're going to clear out all the superstitions. But when you clear out all the superstitions and you focus largely on the material world, what happens is that, especially as you rationalize things, it cuts people off from God.
Yeah.
And so there is this sense that one of the revivals that needs to happen is, I don't want to say necessarily superstition, but you might call a resacralizing of the world, in a sense of where people are able to see and interact with the sacred order, with the metaphysical order, to see the meaning that is out there in the world. Because the world tells us that there is no meaning out there. It's all just like stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And that if it has meaning, you have to give it meaning. And this is part of the problem with like transgenderism and all these things. Like if people are trying to give a material world meaning, right? And so we're saying like, no, the meaning is out there. You have to open your eyes and see God's presence all around you. Now that might bring some superstitions and some of this around the edges, some squishiness, but really people are hungering for the presence of God. So there's this sense of this mystical of things. And so I've been arguing, and one of the things I've been arguing is that we as a community need to counter the technological world in a sense by being what we are, which is people who hunger after the presence of God. And so you want to think of, like, say, the most reactionary thing that you can do in a world where you have this administrative system in government, in business, in nonprofits, in NGOs that are all built on this technological system where there's only one solution for every problem, and that's a technical solution for all problems. What system are we going to put in place to do this? That the one thing that you can do is to pray. And then also in your church community, build real relationships with people. Centered around the presence of God.
Right.
And you think to yourself, like, is it really that easy? And you're like, well, yeah, it's that easy and that hard at the same time. Because anybody's done any reading about seeking the presence of God knows that it's, let's call it a journey.
Yeah, right. One of my mentors, he used to say it this way: if you truly set your mind that you want to grow in godliness and Christ-likeness, and you want to pursue the Lord has two methods of growing us. Typically, there's many, but typically two, and it's prayer and pain. And most of us don't pray enough.
Right. And we don't want to wander in the desert, right? No. And so, we really don't. And the literature on this, going back several thousand years, is very, very clear. That it's kind of how it works, and you can't really avoid it. And this is maybe one of those things too. There's a beautiful sequence in the Gospel of Matthew on this, and all of I think John does not record it, but the synoptics all have this episode. So there is, in Matthew, you have the feeding of the 5,000, then the feeding of the 4,000. Now, what happens in the feeding of the 5,000? There's this, because one of the things that Jesus is doing, you have master-disciple relationship, and what is Jesus teaching his disciples? he's teaching them about the good news of the gospel, who he is and what things. But one of the other things that he's teaching them is faith. And not just faith in the abstract, believing in that God exists or that Jesus exists, that Jesus died as my Lord and Savior, but real faith. So they come to Jesus with this problem and they say, well, we've got this crowd of 5,000 people. They don't have enough to eat. Lord, we need to send them away. And what does Jesus say to them? You feed them. You feed them. And the disciples, they go back to committee and they're like, well, we have, we have only a few. The committee on feeding the 5,000 is reported, Lord, and we've only got so many loaves of bread and fish. You got to send them away. So the Lord, exasperated, he says, here, give me the bread.
Yeah.
And he prays over the bread and he breaks it and he feeds the 5,000. Then he does the same for the 4,000. Then in the Gospel of Matthew, there's the sequence of the walking on water. Why did you doubt? Mm-hmm. Right? Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you. Right? And you're thinking, that's the craziest thing that somebody's probably said in their life, but there's that teaching there. And then there's one other parable that passes. But then you get to this point where they're crossing over the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus says, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. And they're thinking, oh, it's because we forgot bread, right? Because they didn't bring anything to eat.
Right.
And so they're thinking, right? And so Jesus is going to, and in one, it's like the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the other, it's the yeast of the Pharisee and the Herodians, right? So you can look at that and ask, so he's basically looking at two approaches to living the godly. Like one is the Pharisaical, which is more of what we might call almost like holiness tradition. It's, have a code, live up to your code, rationalize the teaching of God. So you do the Talmud and all these things. So you do theology, you do, holiness, you do the code, right? And that's kind of the one approach. And the Pharisees in the day were very popular, very well regarded, right? The other is the Sadducees. So they're the temple priests. They're hooked into the upper level of society, hooked into politics. So it's the faith as, formalism and the political. And that's why you get the, Pharisees and the Herodians, Pharisees and the Sadducees, because they're basically the same thing. So he says, beware of their yeast. And so this is that kind of, the image is of, you have a yeast and a loaf. Well, the loaf is fluffy bread, and the yeast is what makes the bread fluffy. So we today, and this is the danger of the technological system. The technological system, what is it focused on? Consistent results, consistent output. They want fluffy loaves of bread, right? And sure. So we ask the question, well, we've got fluffy loaves of bread, so if we can use managerial systems to make fluffy loaves of bread, isn't that phenomenal? We've got fluffy loaves of bread, right?
Right.
And Jesus says no. And what he does after that, what does he point to? He says, how many baskets were picked up after I fed the 5,000? How many baskets were picked up after I fed the 4,000? And then the funny thing is, he never really spells it out. He just leaves it hanging. And so he says, okay, you look at what's driving the Pharisees, look at what's driving the Herodians and the Sadducees, and then look at what's driving me and the loaf that I'm baking. That's what you want. And so that's really what Jesus is trying to teach his disciples to do, is to sort of bake bread with the power of God. Right? And so we would rather bake bread with technical systems. We have fluffy loaves, but Jesus is saying, it's hard not to come away with the things where he would be like, beware of the yeast of the megachurch.
Sure.
Right? And I know this got you into good territory because you're calling on the authenticity and the sincerity of the people involved and so forth. But at the time, many Pharisees and Sadducees were quite sincere.
Yeah.
And this is why Jesus calling them out for their hypocrisy made them so mad.
Yeah.
Right? Because they felt that they were sincere. So, and this is one of the things that when we begin to apply scripture this way, that, it really cuts to the bone. It cuts quick because we all do it. And so you ask, so what do we do in response? Well, this is really where it is. And so I look at the church right now, one of the big lacunae that you see is that we don't really do true discipleship anymore. We have accountability groups, but accountability groups are not discipleship because they're horizontal. they're peer to peer, whereas discipleship is master to student.
Right.
Right.
Well,
and so there's that, you know what I mean? That type
you're
of thing,
getting
right?
into my, you don't know this. I wrote a book on discipleship, and
Oh, nice.
because I was in the managerial framework, I was thinking, okay, well, look, we're supposed to like go make disciples. It's kind of a big deal. It's kind of like a thing he told us to do.
Yeah.
And like churches should be about this. And so I started to notice that there were all these systems. There's a bunch of playbooks out there. You can pick up this model, this teacher, do this system, do this group. I was like, surely we don't just have 1,000 understandings of what it means to make disciples. Surely there's more like consistency throughout church history. And there's a variety of not just methods, there's, technique and that kind of thing, but there's kind of a consistent understanding, like you said, master, slave, like rabbi or teacher and student. And one of the core...
Probably the best example is like abbot and monk.
Yeah.
Is probably the most enduring one. If you're looking for a real living example, is abbot and monk.
Yeah, and I think one of the tensions is that with discipleship, there's a temptation with seminary and credentialism and even classes in churches, that somehow you graduate at one point and that you cease being a disciple of Christ. That,
yeah,
like, of course, in a hierarchical system, you're going to have different people at different progressions, but the whole idea that we can deracinate and dehumanize and create a system of programming to which people can conform their life to that technique and become a disciple, instead of viewing them as people who are in different places, who have different capacities and giftings and all these kind of things, and then pointing them towards Christ-likeness and all of their capacities, their ability to reason, their affections, their behaviors. And what we get instead are a bunch of churches that are only focused on either intellectual transformation or emotional expression or behavioralism. And it's like, no, like all of them. Like, we want all of it. It's all good. You may have a proclivity towards one or the other more than others, but you still need to behave, even if you just like ideas. And if you just like to behave, you still need to have proper affections for the Lord. So there's my pitch on my book. I'll send you a copy since now you've heard it. Well, I think I've taken enough of your time. This was a great conversation. I want to make sure I point people to, I believe it's seekingthehiddenthing.com. Is that your Substack? Is that right?
Yeah, and that comes from like Seeking the Hidden Thing. That's a biblical reference, but it really comes out of the wisdom tradition, in a sense that we get very focused in the modern era on truth, and really what we should be focusing on is wisdom. Because there's a lot of things in life that lay between other things, and that really only emerge in the moment, right? And that's kind of why, so and this is again the anti-technology, well, not anti, but just pointing people away from the solution isn't technical. It's basically seeking the hidden thing. Yeah. And so that's my thing, www.seekingthehiddenthing.com. Lots of articles there.
That's great.
And number 75 is being written right now.
Okay.
Well, not right now.
Right now, as we are, he is so efficient and so technologically savvy. He is writing as we're speaking. And then I'll put a link to your Twitter as well, so people can follow you there. Well, this was great. Thank you for joining me today, Kruptos.
It was a pleasure having. It's been really good chatting with you, Chase, and hopefully we'll be able to do this again sometime.
All right. Hope you enjoyed this episode of Foolproof Theology. You can find all of our episodes anywhere podcasts are found. Foolproof Theology, look for it, F-U-L-L, Proof Theology. You can also find it on YouTube, Foolproof Theology there for live video. Obviously with this video, I've blocked out Kruptos' face because he's an Anon and changed it with his profile picture on Twitter. But you can go find me on YouTube as well, Foolproof Theology. Make sure you sign up for the Patreon. You can suggest content for me, ask me questions, interact with me on the Patreon, join that crew, and also get swag if you sign up at $5 or $15 a month to support me so I can keep bringing you great content. See you next time.